Hello, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Alan Penn to talk to us about the implications of the COVID pandemic on the future of planning and urbanism. Now, Alan, unlike the holding slide, is actually Chief Scientific Advisor to a government department here in the UK that's recently been renamed. It's now called the Department for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities. But equally significant for the purposes of this talk is the department's responsibility for architecture, for planning, for building regulations, and for local government, all of whom will surely be affected by and may affect the environments in which we live, given the likelihood that we'll be living with some version of the pandemic for the foreseeable future. Alan, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul. So I'm going to start by giving you a précis of what I'm going to say in a nutshell. And it goes along the following lines. Density, putting people together, bringing them together from ancient times has fostered innovation. However, density from ancient times has spread disease. So the current pandemic is not the first in history, so it certainly won't be the last, but it's density that creates it. But there's the paradox. The paradox is that in order to innovate, to develop new technologies, to develop new culture, we need to be together and we need to communicate. And that communication itself comes at a cost to do with disease. I'm going to talk a bit then about the 19th century and London's history of growing to be the world's largest city, which came as well with other pandemics, the cholera, and then the growth of science. So epidemiology was invented out of the cholera pandemics of 1831 and subsequently. And then social reform, the work of Chadwick and Booth and so forth, and then the wonderful work of civil engineering in creating cities that you can live in. Then I'm going to fast forward to COVID. Where are we today? And I'm going to talk about respiratory disease and social distancing and so forth, and ask a question. So I'm going to end with a question, not with an answer. And the question is this the age of architecture? So let's see if I can make it go on to the next slide. Right. So very early in humankind's history, dense urban settlements were created. These date from around about 10,000 BC, so getting on for 12,000 years ago. This is Askeri Hoyuk in the Anatolian Plateau. People may be familiar also with, here's a sort of visualization of what Çatalhöyük, just up the valley, was supposedly looked like. It was really this point in humans' history that everything took off. And I've got a very simple slide to express that. If you go back to 20,000 BC, we're all familiar with the wonderful caves of Lascaux in southern France, and wonderful art. And we're left in no doubt that the painters of those cave paintings would understand modern art today as well as we would understand their art. These are the same culture as ourselves. But then just 10,000 BC, Göbekli Tepe was constructed, and that had amazing sculpture and art, and we're forever just pushing back the date at which this started to happen. We started to build, and Çatalhöyük, and then what came next was an incredibly rapid history of development. By 3,500 BC, we had complex token currency. And that means currency that could be exchanged. So you move from barter to the idea of currency that could be exchanged and to create an economy. By 1750 BC, full-scale writing existed and Hammurabi's code, so the first kind of legal system. And then by 1600 BC, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the first history or perhaps fiction, but whatever, a wonderful creation of writing and telling you the history of the kings and emperors of that early era. Now, that rapid pace of change has been talked about in terms of a transition in climate from the Pleistocene to the Holocene, that created the conditions in which you could have settled agriculture. It became viable. There was enough climate stability for agriculture to take place. But there's a real question. Jane Jacobs thought that what came first was settlement, and then followed the innovations of technology, of agriculture, of money, of writing, and so forth. Now, more recently, Alexandra Korotayev, the Russian anthropologist, has been putting together work on the size of settlements and the size of the states that those settlements were based in. And he shows a generalized relationship between the two. These, by the way, are drawn on a log-log scale. So everything is accelerating incredibly rapidly, actually, from those early days right the way up to the 19th century. And so I'm going to come forward to the 19th century. And I'm going to come forward to the 19th century London with John Snow. Now, John Snow is the founding father of epidemiology, and he started to map the outbreak of cholera and found, this is the outbreak of cholera in Soho in London, and found an association with one of the wells for drinking water and the outbreak of cholera. And what he did was he went down there and he padlocked the well and stopped people from taking the water. Now, in those days, London was really a third world country. It had massive slums, massive problems, and problems that were related to density. They were related to poverty. They were related to mass in-migration of rural populations into the city to work in trade and in manufacture. And they're problems that we see today all over the world in rapidly developing countries. But the solution to this was about potable water, but it was about sewage treatment as well. And his findings gave rise to that, and I'll come on to those. So, yes, there was a whole tradition, of course, of these wonderful 19th century social reformers, and Edwin Chadwick was another. And he looked at a whole range of diseases and showed how they clustered into areas of poverty. If we go on and look at what those places were like, there was immense poverty in London at that time, and this really caught the imagination of the social reformers of Victorian London. Amongst those, Charles Booth, who did these surveys of social class, and he went house to house around the whole of London at the time, and he classified those who were living there according to a whole range of criteria. But essentially what he was doing was looking at all sorts of factors of poverty, of affluence, and of how these were spatialized in the city. And what you see here as a map colored up, so the rich and well-to-do in this map were on the red streets, and then it goes down through pink and blue to the black streets were what he called the vicious semi-criminal classes. These were the slums of the day, where policemen had to go in pairs, otherwise they would be mugged. It was really in that sort of area of London that social reform took place. So what did we do about it? Well, amongst the great reformers was the civil engineer, Bazalgette. And he, in the 1860s, put together plans for how to create a sewage system for London. And it's in the reports on the drainage of town, but the Um, London at the time was a very large city, the largest city in the world, and he put in main sewers, an amazing achievement of civil engineering that has saved more lives than possibly any other advance in medicine. And you can see that network of the main sewers and the sub sewers, which were really um, a wonderful innovation of Victorian times and made it possible to have a city of several million people and to allow them to coexist and to be the economic hub of the whole world at the time, but also to live in health. Um, they were masterpieces of civil engineering. They used Portland cement to stick together, and so these sewers are still working today. They haven't fallen apart. They're a wonderful innovation. And pumping stations. So the pumping station here that was pumped the raw sewage up to allow it to be pushed out into the Thames untreated in the first days at high tide, so that it would flow outwards rather than inwards. And this was the wonderful Victorian um, masterpiece of civil engineering that made London actually a livable place. So there were other problems in London, and the other problems of those, of course, comes from the economy. It was absolutely buzzing with people. If you go to towns in China today, some of them look like this, with hand carts and barrows and traffic everywhere. In China, of course, it's all cars. But at that time in London, horses were the main form of major transportation, and they have a real trouble, which is that they're very hard to reverse. So traffic jams become a right nightmare. So what did we do about it? Well, a whole series of inner city bypasses were constructed in London: Victoria Street, New Oxford Street, Kingsway, and so forth. And these were major bypasses to aid the free flowing of traffic in central London. We constructed a range of tram systems. So the tram systems in London were fantastic. Now, they ran along the streets as well, but the wonderful thing about a tram is that because it's on rails, nobody can park in front of it. And they allowed smooth movement of people to commute in to work in the centre. We constructed railways, and the London Underground, the Underground railway system, was a major masterpiece, but also the overground railway systems that allowed suburban London to be occupied and the expansion of the population, and still maintaining the ability to commute into the centre. These are all major civil engineering contributions to how it was that 19th century London could grow, could expand, could create density and so economy, but also could be livable. And the Victorians were also really interested in ventilation. Now here's a trick. This is ventilation for a prison, Pentonville prison, I think it is, in which they're looking at using heat from boilers and fires to force stack effect ventilation. However, ventilation was seen as a hygienic thing, but nobody properly understood, if you like, what the mechanisms of respiratory illness were. And that's something which has come to the fore just for us now as we fast forward to COVID. But let me just summarize here. This is the growth of London's population, the cholera epidemics of 1830 and onwards, then the creation of the sewage system, the transportation system, and public housing to replace those slums were the major innovations that allowed London to expand and to become a city of 10 million people in a relatively short order. So let's fast forward now to 2020, and we have COVID. We also have a whole range of new technologies. So I've mentioned rail transport and the telegraph from Victorian era, But since then, we've developed air transport. You can now fly all over the world, and then information and communication technologies. So the telephone system has been turned into the internet, mobile phones, and we have the whole range of new technologies that are taking place at the moment, including artificial intelligence and distributed ledgers, robotics, and so forth. So we are undergoing yet another major transformation in society. And at that juncture, we get a global pandemic. What an interesting conjunction that brings these things together. We've all experienced it. Social distancing has been the first measure that we can bring in place. Stay 2 meters away from your neighbor, wear a face mask, and so forth. And as I traveled into London during lockdown, on the occasional trip I made out into town, you could travel on the underground, but this is Camden Town tube station on a Monday morning. I took a photo because you don't see it like that very often. And as a second one, this is Covent Garden. Again, mid-morning on a Monday. You never see it like that, not a person inside. This is what a lockdown city looked like, and it's the result of a couple of things. One, working from home. What you're seeing of me and what I look like working from home is this. So I have moved into my ex-daughter's bedroom, or my daughter's ex-bedroom, put it that way around, and we converted it into an office, and it's become the place in which I now work from home. What does work from home look like? Well, it looks like this. I'm in Teams meetings or Zoom meetings in which everything is constrained into a grid. And here we are, a grid of people, of faces with names. And this has some really interesting properties to it. The first is we're constrained in a grid. The second is we know who people are. In some ways, it's much more democratic. Quiet people seem to get a voice, certainly in the chat. But you can have a meeting here with 49 people on the screen and actually another 102 or something in the who you can't see, that brings people together in which you can have remarkably fluid communication. However, there's something about this, which is that it lacks the serendipity that you get from face-to-face bumping together in the corridors of the office. So a lot of people have talked about the problem that creates for what the culture of work is like. There's another feature, and that is everything has now disappeared into the diary manager's area. This is the screen for the diary. You're booked into meetings, Teams meetings or Zoom meetings, minute after minute throughout the day. It's the diary manager's dream, of course, because matter transport is not a problem. You can be in one meeting that ends on the hour and in the next that starts on the hour. And that really does create a change in the culture of work. But it does mean that everything is to do with pre-planning and synchronization, where previously, as you move around a building, you're brought into contact with others. And as you rub into them and bump into them at the coffee machine or the water cooler, as people talk about, or just in the corridor, you have conversations that you didn't know you needed to have. In this planned form, it's only the people who think that they need to meet other people that they know they need to meet that get together. And that creates a really different culture. It's one that carries massive risks for innovation. So, there is a question. The world population now is nearly 8 billion people. Air transport means that everywhere is just hours away from everywhere else. We can fly around the world and be in China in 11 hours and have a face-to-face meeting. When you arrive in China, you may well be in a city with 40 or more million people in that city. It may be connected by high-speed transport into a whole range of other cities of a similar scale, just a few hours away, high-speed rail or air. And you will be, I can almost guarantee, in China in a very polluted environment. Yes, it's the air pollution is a current challenge. Now, we all know that respiratory disease is related to population density. The reason for this is that when you cough, and respiratory diseases make people cough, you splatter out little droplets of and aerosols that carry virus, and those virus then others breathe in or touch and lick or do something else that transmits them into their body. So what we're seeing at the moment with the Delta variant and potentially the new Omicron variant of the virus, of the COVID virus, is rapid transmissibility. It is something that is crafting itself to be ever more successful in transmitting from the original case to as many others as it can. And that transmissibility is something that passes through air. Now, this is where it differs from cholera. Cholera was an orofecal disease. Cholera was a disease that went from excrement into water that was then ingested, and the solution was get rid of the excrement through Bazalgette sewage, make sure the water is potable, so get good supplies of clean water, keep the two well apart and have regulations, building regulations that enforce that, and have good hygiene. Wash your hands, boil the water if you're suspicious about it, and so forth. And orofecal diseases were the great problem of the 19th century, and still are the great problem in many parts of today's world where potable water is not available. But as you go to a respiratory disease, what matters is social distance and ventilation. Now, air moves around buildings. It moves through windows and doors. It moves from room to room between the doors. And it's how the building is ventilated is a key component to respiratory transmission. Similarly, social density, the presence of people next to each other, is a key determinant of transmission as well. So the more closely you pack people together, the more likely transmission is to take place. This is not the realm of civil engineering so much. It may be building services engineering in terms of ventilation systems, and ventilation is very important, but it's actually the realm of architecture. So what I'm going to suggest here is that we are now moving from the age of civil engineering as being the great reforming public health profession, if you like, to the realm of architecture becoming the great reforming and public health profession. Because it's for us as architects to resolve the paradox. And the paradox is the paradox of the economy and culture and society depend on communication and depend on social density and face-to-face transaction. But the respiratory diseases, the various bird flus and the coronavirus that we have today, are the big risk factor for the world population as we now have it. Now, you see it also in globalization. COVID hit, but it hit remarkably rapidly. And that's because the movement from from Wuhan to the rest of China and to the rest of the world was something that was transmitted by people flying around the world. And the age of air transport means that it's quite possible for people to be from one side of the globe to the other side within just hours. Far faster, by the way, than it becomes apparent that you have a pandemic on your hands. And that means that everything had transmitted almost before people knew that there was a problem at hand. And that problem, that challenge, is one which will only increase going forwards. We will survive coronavirus, but the next respiratory disease, the next zoonotic disease that comes in and ends up in our massive dense cities will or could be just as disruptive. We've learnt a lot from the pandemic. We've learnt of the importance of vaccination, and we've learned that it is possible to develop vaccines much faster than has ever been done before. And so that's a great help. But it won't help in the next virus that appears. We will still have the 6 to 9 months that it'll take to develop the next vaccine and to get it tested and safe before we can take over and implement. And so this means that we need to be prepared for how respiratory diseases in particular can be contained. And that's where we need to start thinking about the buildings that we build, the nature of ventilation, and the nature of the way that we deliver our economy. Can we design systems for distance-based communication, for the Teams and Zoom and various other strands of technology that have supported working from home, but which afford a much more architectural serendipity of contact between people? Is there a way that architects could get involved in the design of these systems themselves? Now, in fact, I've done that in the past. It's something which there are ways of thinking about, but these have yet to make it into the technology platforms today. But it's certainly an area where architectural understanding could be the key to the next generation of information technology that we need. You will all have seen Zuckerberg's metaverse video. Goodness me, he needs some architects, and he needs some design to move that idea of the metaverse, which is not a daft idea, but to turn it into something that will actually be functional in creating cultural and social context within which people can share and construct transactions and communicate and form communities and organizations. So my final point on all of this is that ventilation is key for the building itself as a physical object, and it passes through the same spaces that people pass through when they're being brought into contact. The same mechanisms that we have for thinking about how air moves through buildings and for how people move through buildings require us to think of buildings in spatial terms. And in the digital arena, we need to inject some understanding from architectural experience of what it takes to create a world that is that has serendipity, that has a culture to it, and that creates the opportunities for interaction, which are what we so much miss when we are segregated and working from home. I think I'm going to stop there and take questions. So thank you very much. I can't hear you, Paul.
Presentation. Can you hear me now?
Yes, right.
Very good. That was a typically thoughtful and provocative, in a constructive way, presentation, which sets off all sorts of questions. For one thing, would you agree that one of the things that architects don't often talk about is volume rather than space? They talk about space, they talk about the sequencing of space, but the question of volume seems to be relatively undiscussed, even though it's really a critical thing for what it is that architects create. And perhaps the question of respiratory disease, air circulation and ventilation will sort of force a greater focus on this aspect of design.
Paul, I think you're absolutely right. And I'm never quite sure whether it's architects that don't talk about volume or whether it's the quantity surveyors. There's always been this pressure to reduce your floor to ceiling height. And this, of course, got to its zenith in the 1960s and 70s when people produced buildings with very low floor to ceiling heights, which then created a real problem when it came to the world of wires and air conditioning and ventilation systems, when you needed to put somewhere to put the wires and put the ducts. and a lot of buildings ended up being demolished because their floor-to-ceiling heights were too low to be retrofitted for more modern communication and ventilation. It's always seemed to me that one of the beautiful things about taking over a Victorian building has been the ceiling heights. And goodness me, wouldn't it be nice to get back to a world in which the volume of the room is considered valuable rather than considered a waste of money? It might do some very odd things to building, well, to heights of buildings. It may be that we need taller buildings in order to accommodate the same number of floors, but with a greater floor-to-ceiling height. But I do agree, volume is a key component here.
Well, most of our regulations, certainly in the UK, seem to be more greatly focused on area than volume. And we don't really have any scientific way of describing the relationship between area and volume. I mean, we say things are double height space or height and a half, but we don't really have a commonly understood way of saying what the ratio is. So you could say a Victorian house has a ratio of X, whereas houses from the 1960s or 70s, it might be X minus 20%. This would surely be useful as part of a kind of suite of thinking about where do we go from here.
I think that's right, and it's a conundrum of regulations, of course, is they tend to specify minima. So you get a minimum floor-to-ceiling height specified. You never get a maximum, and you actually never get a mean, suggested right height, if you like. It's always the minimum that's specified. I guess it goes back to the days of Parker Morris in terms of plan areas being the thing rather than any other measure, and even though those are now considered to be very large compared to what current is sort of financially driven plans will deliver. It does seem to me that the issue of thinking about volumetrics is actually very relevant.
The other thing that struck me in your presentation was this intriguing suggestion that actually, architects think about it already, but that actually clients and I guess governments might start thinking more about the contribution that design has to make to the design of systems. I mean, your engaging image of the world of the grid, in which everybody suddenly sort of looks as though they're the same dimensions, is an intriguing example. And I suppose with your background in computer technology as well as architecture, is there an architecture, in quote marks, of kind of computer systems that is sort of nascent? Is there thinking there which could be unlocked? Or do you think it requires to be prompted, ab origino, as it were?
I think it does. I mean, I would say that very often I find that some of our architectural students go off into the world of user experience design. And they're working for computer companies, and they're not daft. They're very well paid. What they're doing is they're taking their architectural design skills and applying these in the world of user interfaces in computational systems. That, I think, is something that's set to grow. Now, if we were surveyors, we would probably invent a new chapter of our professional body to be the user experience design chapter. But as architects, we tend not to think that anybody who doesn't design buildings is a proper architect. I think it's somewhere where we should be more flexible. Certainly, my students are more flexible in thinking about their career choices. And even though they may never use the word architect in future, they're taking those same architectural skills and using them to intuit what a system will be like, and what other people will feel about it as they use it. It requires a different set of thinking because computer systems are dynamic. and they operate in real time. So the sketch doesn't quite capture what you see. You need to sketch with dynamics involved, and there are ways of doing that. But it's something which I think will come to the fore. I mean, it's already there, actually. It's already happening all over the world.
Because I suppose the irony is that architects and designers spend an awful lot of their time actually imagining virtual space. I mean, clearly it's not real until it's built. And that sort of intermediate stage of imagining it and then producing the drawing or the 3D model or the render, that kind of halfway house is a sort of intriguing thing. And picking up your point, it's a sort of language thing where even in countries with protected titles of architect, nevertheless, you still get the world of the software architect, who by and large are not architects, but actually there's a sort of understanding that what's going on there is a kind of design activity, whether one thinks of it as design or not.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think I'm all for breaking down the boundaries, because now we're sitting here talking not face to face, but through a screen to everybody else's screen, and everybody else in this conference will be sitting possibly in their own homes, in their own bedrooms or wherever, looking through little screens and windows on the world. I've taken my most isolated room in the house has become my office, which is now the closest place to the rest of the world. Other people select to work in the kitchen. Our kitchens tend to be the ones that are the most accessible places in the house. It's the sort of prime space where everybody meets up at parties. And that's not only because that's where the drink and the food is, it's also because of the way it's constructed into the house plan. So there's an interesting emerging domestic space issue here about how people choose to work from home and how these interfaces invade your most private spaces. And is that a problem, or is that actually part of the solution? And I think all of that will emerge over the coming few years as new systems come into play.
Well, it's an intriguing issue for both the clients and designers of new residential apartments or houses, as to the provision or not of specific areas which used to be called studies in rather large houses. And the sort of decisions that are being made now really on financial grounds is whether you say, well, we'll have a second bathroom or a third bathroom even in a larger house. Actually, we won't. We'll make that a study. Alternatively, does the nature of the space, whether it's the third bedroom or whether it's the kitchen, does it lend itself to different sorts of adaptation and different sorts of furniture design and so on and so forth? And I suppose the more one thinks about this is bound to play into planning and into regulation, where every home is now a part working office.
I think that's right. And most obviously, broadband provision. I think your house will be unsaleable if it doesn't have good, fast internet in the future. I think that having adequate space in which to work from home has become a key criteria for many people in their choice of where to move to. And I think that the other part of this is there's an urban dimension, a locational dimension, which is that people are choosing to move to where there's green space in their vicinity. So having a garden, or very least a balcony, is all important. But then being in an area where there's somewhere where you can go for your hour's walk. And I think that is an interesting trend in terms of people's locational decisions about where to live.
Well, I think that's another question hanging in the air for government, and they're going to need all the advice they can get over the next few years. And I'm delighted that you're involved with that, at least here in the UK. Alan Penn, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.